everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. I'm your co-host today, Mike Zaremba. And if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome to the show. And if you're a returning visitor, thanks for joining us again. Welcome back. As per usual, we are podcasting here at a Float House. Float House is the sponsor of Vancouver Real. And our address here is 70 West Cordova Street in downtown Vancouver, BC. Floathouse.ca is our website. And what do we do here at Float House? Basically, we do flotation therapy, or the practice of floating. And what that kind of is a very unique environment created by a flotation tank, where you get to go into an environment of maximal sensory reduction created by 10 inches of water with 1,000 pounds of Epsom salts inside. So you float effortlessly, which is heated to the same temperature as the surface of your skin. So once you settle into that solution, it's hard to tell where your body ends and the water begins. That boundary kind of dissolves. It also creates an environment of minimal tactile sensations, and it is pitch black inside, and it is basically sound deadened to a, utmost degree, because your ears are underwater with earplugs in, so you don't really hear anything external to you. So, like the name implies, sensory deprivation tank, you are maximally reducing sensory input into your central nervous system, which creates a very strong parasympathetic response, a very strong relaxation response in our body. So it's very calming for the central nervous system, and it takes people into a great place for mental health, well-being. It can help people with chronic pain issues, and a lot of people love it for its meditation and mindfulness practice, and kind of going within, reorientating your awareness into the inner realms, and which we'll definitely be chatting a little bit about today, folks, with once we dive into our guests. So, and also joining me is Andy.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be back on Vancouver Real. And with Float House, we have the the membership, which is probably the most. It is definitely the best bang for your buck when it comes to floating, and you get basically as much floating as you want for a very reasonable price. And on top of that, Mike's recently started a Float House community page. So it's really cool, because if you become a member of Float House, you can become part of the community page, where Mike's actually leading that group and facilitating group discussion. And also, we had one morning where you came in at like 5:30 in the morning, and you led an early morning float session, which sounded really amazing to me.
Yeah, basically we had 9 tanks opened up at 5 a.m. on one Saturday morning, early Saturday morning, and just basically did a large group float. Obviously everybody in their own tanks, but it was really cool to wake up early, interrupt that sleep cycle, and then kind of dive into the float environment and have a 2.5 hour long float.
Yeah. Some of my best float experiences are actually right after I wake up, and if I can roll out of bed and not have a coffee and just come right in and just go right into the tank, I find my floats are much more lucid, and I have a lot more imagery and visualizations while I'm actually in the tank, which is incredible. So definitely, if you are a member at Float House and you're listening to this, join up with the, what is it called? The Float House members community page,
something like that. I think it's a membership page.
Membership page. We're gonna put posters up in the center, so you'll be able to find it eventually. Yeah. Speaking of communities, that's one of the communities that we're fostering right now. The other one, which is more ongoing, which you've probably heard of at this point, is the Vancouver Real community. And what we're doing every single month is we're having monthly meetups, which are always free, and we have different experts in different fields come in for every single month and teach some sort of a workshop. Like we've had movement workshops. In fact, the one's coming up in July is another movement workshop. In August, we're actually doing a Seek the Sky event, where we're all going to go and hike the Chief, which will be really cool. Of course, it's free. All you have to do is make your way up to the Chief and join us, and we're all going to hike the Chief together, which should be pretty awesome. And we've done things like website building workshops and nutrition workshops. So we like to cover like a whole plethora of subjects, and just all ways to help facilitate your own personal growth. And we like to do it for free, just in conjunction with the podcast. And it's great because it's nice to have these conversations, when we're just speaking one way, but to actually have those in-person communications, to have like those in-person interactions is really, really powerful, and have that community feeling behind it. So that's the Vancouver Real Meetups, and it's headed by Candace White and Sean. And you can join up with that page. It's Vancouver Real Community on Facebook. You can just ask to join the group, and somebody will accept you into it. And on top of that, we're now doing mindful mass meditations, and that's another Facebook group which right now has about 1,000 people in it, and we're doing free public meditations. So what we're doing is we're going around to public spaces, and we're just sitting, and they're actually all led by Carolyn Ann Budgell. She's a local yoga teacher / meditation teacher, and she leads us all through a guided meditation in public areas, which is really fun, and it's great just to meditate in community, and then also the community that happens afterwards. Everyone's very relaxed and zenned out and very like-minded. So if that appeals to you, look for the Mindful Mass Meditation Mob Vancouver on Facebook, and you can join that group as well and stay up to date with all the meditations. Or you can go to mindfulmass.org or vancouverreal.tv for both those communities to link up with them if you're not on Facebook. Yeah. So that's all I have for today.
Cool. All right. I think that's a great place to leave it, and we'll dive into our conversation today. I'm really excited for this one. We have a longtime friend joining us, someone who's been here and around Float House for years now. He actually helped us move in the giant salt rock when we got it here. And I'm talking about Robert Ellison. And Robert is a good friend of mine and a teacher of mine. I've been working with him for a couple of years now personally, and basically exploring shamanism and learning some of these teachings that he's picked up over his time. And well, first of all, Robert, welcome to Vancouver Real.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Andy.
And just a little bit more of an intro for you. I mean, it's hard to, I just call you Robert, but in terms of, what you do and who you are and what your kind of work is, basically, for lack of a better term, I would say you are a shaman. You're a practicing shaman, and you help people with different elements of shamanic healing, and you'll also work with energy and clear spaces for people. And so, I mean, we're going to kind of dive into this stuff today and kind of talk about, unpack what I just said there a little bit, because it's kind of a mouthful. But yeah, thanks for coming on the show. We're really happy to have you here.
Oh, you're welcome, Mike. Yeah.
Cool. So I guess in terms of a starting place, we'll just start with there. Like, as I described you to be as a shaman, would you say that is a suitable name for what I'm trying to get at, I guess? Or what do you like to use?
Like, I try to stay away from labels. Actually, that's, as far as shamanism per se, that's what we try to do, is we try to stay out of labels and roles, so we can be flexible, so we can keep our freedom.
Right.
Basically, if I was to say kind of what I'm teaching you and teaching others, as well as practicing myself, is how do we stay in freedom? Because whatever's happened to us in our past takes away from our freedom, because we think we have to be this certain person, right?
Right.
And so shamanism, like, shaman is kind of a Eastern Siberian term used for, like, I think it was Mircea Eliade, who first kind of used that term in Western terminology when he was writing about, say, shamans.
Yeah.
And basically he defined it as somebody using an altered state of consciousness in helping people. And so it really has a really broad kind of definition that's pretty loose, right?
Right.
And so there are many different types of shamans, right? And whether or not I would actually call myself that, there are definite aspects of that in which I use in helping people.
Right. Well, let's kind of, if I was to ask you the question, and you're trying to explain it to somebody, like, what is shamanism, or the shamanic arts, if you will, how would you even start to explain that, and maybe the type of work that you do, if you would even label it that?
Yeah, well, it's hard, right? Because say if you look through some of the Hindi literature, they'd say that it's possible for human beings to have about 170 different gifts, right? From clairaudience, clairvoyance, all these different things that you want to name, right? They say there's 170. And they'd say, like, somebody like Buddha or Jesus might have like about 100 or 110.
Okay.
So to a certain extent, what we're trying to do is open up that sensitivity or that sensory awareness beyond our 5 normal senses.
Okay. So like an intuitive sense, perhaps.
Well, that would be one.
Okay.
And, right.
Right. And like you said, you mentioned clairaudience, clairvoyance, clairsentience. These are things used to describe different, just different, senses people can have that maybe haven't been fully understood scientifically, but seem to be just patternistically behave.
Sorry. Just as somebody wants to look up those 170 points, is there like a website they can go to that can outline what they are, or a resource somewhere?
I'm trying to think of the text that I saw that actually mentioned that.
Okay.
But in my reading, I'm not sure, but it was in one spot that just kind of, because I go wow, 170? That blew my mind.
And do they have a special term for it? I'm sure they have some kind of Hindi or Vedic term potentially for those gifts, if you want to call them.
So those gifts are kind of like siddhas.
Siddhas. Okay.
Right.
So if somebody looked up that and Google it, you could probably figure out what a lot of them are potentially.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
People, if you want to look it up and Google it and write it in the comments section, go right ahead, because we don't know.
Right. So siddha, I've heard that term before as like a it's like a spiritual, or not maybe a spiritual power, like a power, a sense, or like you said, a gift perhaps.
Right.
Okay. And from your standpoint, would you say that everyone has some sort of siddha or gift?
So there's probably some that you're aware of already, right? Now the thing is, a human being is whole, so everybody's got all of them. Mm-hmm. It's just that they're not awake yet, right? So even when I'm teaching people, I kind of say that it's like I can show you that there's a doorway there, right? Or I can try to show you that there's a doorway there. Now, you may or may not be able to see that doorway. Now, if you can't see that doorway, I have to try and use my gifts and kind of show you maybe how I see that doorway, or how I know that doorway is there. Mm-hmm. And so then I'll try a number of different ways I know how to see that doorway. Now, if you still don't get that doorway, I have to connect in through you to see how you will see that doorway, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I don't know, because I'm going to try and show you every way that I know how to see that doorway. Now, for me, that's really exciting if you still don't get it. And a little bit scary on my part, because my ego will go through this thing, well, what kind of teacher are you? You can't show this person the doorway, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Right? But now the exciting part comes, because now I have to try and go through you and see through your eyes how you would see that doorway.
Right.
And then in that, I learn a new gift, because I help you become aware of the gift that you've got to see the doorway. But then through me helping you, I actually also receive that gift. Mm-hmm. And that's the exciting part of this work.
And I think for myself, in trying to, I'd say, connect with this cosmology, this perspective of this, for lack of a better term, but for this conversation, a shamanic perspective. It's something that you have to kind of discard a lot of the rational things and rationales that I've learned before, and just be open. Not that you have to enter in with a false beliefhood, but it's like, okay, well, can you be open to something you don't know? And are you open to something that you don't know you even could know? The unknowns of the unknowns kind of thing.
Right.
So, and can you just maybe talk a little bit about, or just comment on that, of this being open to perhaps what is beyond our contemporary culture's way of relating to being alive as a human being and being in physical reality?
Okay. So first of all, I think I'm just going to touch on a little bit is that most of my teachings come from the mountains of Peru. For the most part, through a tribe of people called the Caro. And nobody actually knew that they existed until the 1950s, right? They were hidden up in the mountains. They kind of ran away from the Spaniards when the Spaniards came through Peru, and they ran up. And so they managed to keep, for the most part, most of their teachings intact all the way kind of to the present day. Mm-hmm. And they've got no idea of a term called shaman. If you go up there and start asking in their up in their villages and ask for the local shaman or whatever, they've got no idea what you're talking about. Because for them, it would be considered in Quechua a Paco, which is basically just a person who's connected to the different energy and can actually speak to spirits, whether it's spirits of plants or to beings, and so can communicate to something beyond what a normal person can communicate to. Now, to a certain extent, in our modern Western world, it takes some sort of shakeup before somebody will actually kind of consider something that's not actually physical and that can't scientifically be proven and da-da-da-da-da, right? So for me, I had a bunch of things in my childhood. Number one, I'd say my grandfather passing, and it totally devastated my mother. And when she came in to tell me that he had passed, I said, no, he's not gone anywhere. He's still right here, which made her even more distraught. But I could sense and could actually communicate with him, so then I knew that there was something else out there, right? So I had that ever since I was like 6, 7 years old, right? Like the year after that happened, my grandmother asked me, well, what do you think that your grandfather would like for his birthday? Because his birthday was the day after mine. Right. And so I said, he wants red carnations and black forest cake. And she just broke down in tears. She goes like, how did you know that? I go like, he's telling me. She goes, and she was strictly religious. She goes, you can't talk like that. Right.
So you were like, so kind of in the middle of like, of where that, I guess what a lot of children, well, I don't know a lot of children, but like, people have said like children have different, an openness, a different relationship with reality in their first early years, and that's what you can kind of describe there is that point where perhaps that ability to sense something a bit more, a mystical sense would you could say, gets met with an authority figure of saying no, and perhaps you have to either accept that no or
well you do just to get accepted. So by your own family. So like if you want to feel accepted, at some point you just say, no, okay, I'm not going to talk about it. Right.
So that's that repression element when you're just trying to be.
Well, it's just education, because nobody else around you may have that sense, right? Like a little further on, when I was 10, like we were babysitting this boy who was the same age as me, and I didn't care for him because my parents said, oh, you have to give him all your toys and stuff. And we went down to the beach, and all of a sudden he disappeared, right? And my mom said, Robbie, now you go find little Johnny. I go, I don't like little Johnny. I don't care where he went, and I'm not going looking for him. She said, you go look for him now, right? And in that moment, I knew exactly where he was. And I didn't go looking down the beach for him or anything. I went swimming out into the water and then swam out on a 45-degree angle about 50 yards out. And I get out there, and here's the little boy, and his nose is about an inch underneath the water, and he's basically drowning. Right? And so I put him up on my chest, and I backstroked him in, and my cousin was there who was a nurse, and she gave him mouth-to-mouth and brought him back. Like, and to this day, my cousin will ask, like, how did you know where that boy was? It was impossible for you to know where that boy was. It just wasn't logical. You went straight out there, and if you didn't go straight out there the way you did, he was dead. Right? And I just knew.
So with that, what is that then? And how does
I don't know what that was like. Clear knowledge, right? I knew exactly where he was.
Right. And what point does that illustrate? And then in terms of kind of being open to things that haven't yet been explained by, say, science?
Well, the thing is, I think every single person, right? I think creation or spirit or divine mystery, whatever you want to term it, is knocking on our door 24/7, right? And the thing is, we've been educated or repressed, or however you want to term it, so that we don't listen to the knock. We don't listen to the knock on the door. That's, to a certain extent, what floating is about. Floating is going in to try and get into a quiet space, because, like, through all the different lineages of teaching, it says go into the quiet space of yourself and listen. And then you might hear the voice of your soul, right? So that's the spot that, like, you're trying to create in something like that. Now, as far as a person being a shaman or whatever, they've kind of gone through different techniques of ways to actually quiet the mind so that they can actually make a connection there through 170 different ways. So there's no two people that are ever going to be exactly alike. You can call them a shaman, right? Like, probably within the Vancouver area, there's probably thousands of people who would kind of call themselves shamans, right?
Right.
And no two of them would be the same.
Right. So in terms of, like, back to that initial kind of question of, like, well, what is shamanism, or what does a shaman do? You know, what sorts of things then, if someone is kind of more sensitive and then also aware of this otherness, how does that kind of unfold, let's say, pragmatically in someone's life, or in like someone they're trying to work with?
So let's say, like, historically, what a shaman was. A shaman was kind of like the spiritual protector and kind of leader of the tribe, right? And in old times also, they may also be like the king or queen, because they're responsible, because what the viewpoint is that creation rains down benevolence upon the earth, and it's up for the shaman to actually communicate with the divine to make sure that there's prosperity here on earth, right? And in the old times, basically, it wasn't just a willy-nilly thing that you'd say, oh, I'm the shaman. Like, you'd have to be accepted by a group of people. And the thing is, you'd have to be able to prove your stuff. Like, if the tribe all of a sudden went into despair, and for any more than 2 or 3 years, they'd kill the shaman. Because they'd say, you're no longer in connection with the divine, and you can't lead us so that we're in balance with the divine, that we can feel prosperity. So in the old times, they'd kill him, right? And to a certain extent, that comes down even to the modern day with, say, like the Queen of the Queen of England, where she's actually head of the church. So that's actually kind of like a shamanic practice. She's actually got both titles, right? That was the same thing actually Jesus was doing. He wanted the kingship and the priesthood, right? To show that he had that authority. Right? Now, in the modern sense of kind of what a shaman might be more considered a healer. Okay. In different aspects. Right? Now, there's a lot more to it than that, but you use what knowledge that you might get in the other realms to actually help a person who's in problem. Right. Say, in a real modern context, right now there's a lot going on with people with addictions. Right? Because actually it's never ever the substance, whatever the substance is. Mm-hmm. Like it can be as simple as food, right? It doesn't have to be heroin or crack or whatever, but it's those things as well. Right. But what the addiction points to is that there's a woundedness. There's some wound that's there, that for the person not to feel the wound, they put some sort of substance in it so that they feel good. Because whatever the wound is, and generally the biggest wounds normally happen between 0 and 7. And that's when just a child is trying to form a reality. And the basic reality is, well, my parents are God and Goddess, and they give me all the good that they can, right? Now, something happens during that childhood period where there becomes a mistrust with a parent or something. That breaks down the whole thing of what creation is, and that creation is good. And then because the assumption is the parents are God and Goddess, and so they can do no wrong, that if they're punishing me, and especially if they punish me very, very strongly, then there must be something wrong with me. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that's the big wound that almost everybody has, is that in somewhere that happened, sometimes with more intent or less intent, and then the child grows up but never actually gets to overcome that wound. So we're all looking for acceptance, which is the big wound, and we'll do whatever it is, right?
Right. And so
do you think it's possible to get out of that 0 to 7 age bracket without having some sort of wound? Because to me it seems like it's pretty tough to have parents that are that conscientious where they wouldn't cause any problems.
Well, no. Well, the thing is, to a certain extent, it's hard because most parents weren't that conscious when they had us, right? And so then and they would just raise their kids the way they were raised. And so if you go back a couple of generations and you had the war and you had the Depression and all that stuff, things were really tough, right? And say if you look in the First Nations community here, you've got all the stuff that happened through residential schools and all that, right? So that all gets passed on, right?
Right. So that whatever mentality that they needed to get through that really hard time just gets passed on to, how they're being raised as children. And of course, it's just that same wounding gets passed on generationally is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, it's just hard when a person comes to me, say, I have to kind of spend some time just talking with them to find out, okay, where are they at?
Like, do you ask about their family history? Is that where you start?
For sure. Well,
I
start with what's happening for them right now, because generally there's a cycle.
Right. So there's some kind of issue in their life, some sort of repeating problem, and you identify that, and then you start going deeper into, well, is that cyclical? And then what potentially is causing that at a deeper level?
Right.
Right.
And so then you're, for me, for the most part, what I'm doing is I'm leading them through a set of processes to let go of the energy of the wounding.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important kind of thing to talk about as well, is how, you said, they could be looked at as a healer, and what you're doing is you're guiding somebody through a process so that their correct me if I'm wrong, that sometimes their self-healing mechanism can kind of kick in, like by integrating this wound or bringing light to it or something, and identifying like whatever it is helps them.
Well, it's basically releasing the energy. Basically, we stuff down the energy, right?
Right.
So you can everybody can probably think back to when they're a child and they're told to shut up or to not speak.
Right.
Right. And so whatever the emotion was coming up, like even if you're crying, stop crying, whatever. So then you'd have to stuff that in somewhere. Mm-hmm. Now, as an analogy, it's like you're stuffing a little bubble of sadness or resentment or something deeper inside you, right? So then at some point, somebody might trigger you. Like that's why I say relationships, especially like partnership and stuff, are so amazing as far as personal work, because the other person's going to trigger you. No matter how shiny and beautiful you think they are when you meet them, whether it's a year, 6 months, or 2 years down the road, you're going to get triggered. Mm-hmm. And you're going to feel these bubbles of sadness or resentment or stuff start to come up.
Yeah.
And you're going to shove them. Or maybe the person's really good at triggering you enough that you're just going to explode and some of these things are going to come out. Now, the thing is, through this work is like, hey, can you conscientiously go in and find out some of these bubbles and let them out in a relatively controlled way? So then you're not going to respond the same way to somebody kind of what would trigger you before won't trigger you now.
Mm-hmm. I kind of like when you're talking like that, it reminds me of like how they're describing the mechanisms to their understanding at this point of like say PTSD. Now maybe it's not on an extreme scale of you saw something horrific in warfare and like you had this incredible shock effect, and then that shock effect imprinted or was like in your central nervous system that never was able to be dissipated properly. But it's like, well, if your father or somebody is a big person and you're a little child, and then you do something that they correct you on and they frighten you, well, that's probably pseudo equivalent to a PTSD effect.
From the child's point of view, like you described before, that's basically God getting upset with you.
Right. So what could be more?
That's the most terrifying thing.
What could be the most terrifying thing?
Like parents are everything to the child. Like the child completely 100% depends on those two parents to let them survive. And as soon as like that, that father or mother is angry with them, all of a sudden my survival is being threatened. It's not just like,
exactly. And it could be anger, or it could be a disconnection. Like let's say, the parent is, worrying about something in their life, in their adult life, right? They're worrying about the rent or the mortgage or the bills or their mother that's passing away, and they're not able to be fully present with the child at that point in time. They maybe like push them away, or some form of analogy of pushing them away, right? Then same sort of thing. Like you feel this like, oh, something I must be like the child's like perceiving is I'm doing something wrong that they don't love me right now or something, and then they perceive love as conditional.
On this level, a child learns pretty quick that love is conditional. Right. And in a few different traditions that they would say in humanity there is no unconditional love. There's always some sort of condition. Like even a mother with its child, there's a condition. The mother gets joy out of seeing the child happy. Right? And even though that's about as pure as we can get, there's still some conditions in there. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Do you think it's almost necessary though, in order for a child to be socialized properly, to like put those boundaries and constraints on them? Even if they don't want it and they actually get hurt by it a little bit. If I can imagine if you didn't do that with a child, they would be kind of wild, So it's like they have to be socialized to some extent in order for them just to get along with the society that they're being raised in.
They learn, like children learn what the conditions are, right? Like say I think the first time I went in the high Andes up into Queros, basically, I was going on a pilgrimage, but I took a bunch of stuff for school children. And so we ran into the mother with two young kids, about 6 and 7, that were going to school. Right? And I reached down and I gave a handful of candy to each one. Right? Now, they're conditioned like in such a way that they didn't even take a candy. They turned around right away. They gave both handfuls of candy to their mother. Didn't take a single candy. Didn't keep one. Didn't hold one. And my jaw hit the floor. And so I asked them, I said, like, well, why didn't you take a candy? Right? Wouldn't you like to enjoy a candy? And the little kids, like I said, they're 5 and 6. They said, we give it to our mother because we totally trust our mother that when our mother knows that it's right for us to have a candy, that she'll share the candies back with us. And I mean, I had tears in my eyes. Because could you imagine, like anywhere here, like you give a kid a handful of candies, probably almost the whole thing of candies is straight in their mouth.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, potentially. I mean, ideally, you don't want your child accepting candies from strangers. This is not necessarily good practice, but yes. But that's why I was getting away from the point. But the point is, like, we have to put these constraints on a child in some way to socialize them, which in some way is going to cause some sort of wounding for pretty much everyone, even if your parents are the gentlest, kindest beings out there.
Well,
potentially you're still going to get that. And I guess my overarching point to that is that, I feel like it's a journey that people have to go through in their life just to develop properly. And then they have to go and heal their old wounds. And then once they've healed that, they become closer to being actualized in some way.
Like those I guess some of those definitions, like actualized or enlightened or whatever, for me, I try to stay away from. For me, it's about helping people get into freedom from whatever the past kind of made people so that they don't have a free choice anymore.
Totally.
Right? Yeah. So
I think we're just talking semantics at that point, but yes, generally, so they can live their life as an authentic expression of how they want to live it.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, again, there's lots of definitions on how you can,
like basically a human being is kind of pure desire, right? Like if I have a desire for this glass of water, I'm going to reach for the glass of water and I'm going to have a drink. And that's a totally egoic desire, right? And creation wants to fulfill every single desire. Like creation doesn't have any judgment per se on what the desire is. Now, the thing is, you might have a certain desire, but there might be a consequence for it, right? Which is different than a judgment. It's like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? And that's part of learning where our place is in the universe as far as energetically, so that we can actually see what the ramifications of our decisions are. Now, free choice comes down to kind of three things. Like what you learn and who you learn it from is the first one. The second one is who you hang out with. And the third one is where you go. Now, once you make those three choices, the universe acts on you. And then you act through your subconscious self, unless you can actually stop it and be really conscious of what's going on. Then you can stop an interaction. And that comes from your teachings, right? Now, the thing is, can we be aware that we're making those conscious decisions? Because once we do, then it's like the world becomes a different place. It's not like we're trying to get to some other place that's not Vancouver, right? That's not the goal. The goal of spiritual things isn't to go off and pretend that we're in the float tank or whatever and be connected to the divine and never actually be here, right? Now, in aspects, we can go and we can make connection and we can ask questions and form intentions of what we need or what we think we need. Because there's no judgments on what we want to do, right? Again, there's ramifications for decisions that we make. And you could have the exact same situation, say when you're 18, and the exact same seemingly situation come up now, and you think that you're going to make the exact same situation because it turned out good back when you were 18. Well, the time and space is different now. Maybe you need a totally different decision because now you're in your mid-30s as opposed to when you're 18, right?
I think the simplest example I can think of that is around diet. When you're 18, you can pretty much eat whatever you want and not gain any weight or be relatively unaffected by it. When you eat, one piece of cake on a weekend, it seems like you just gain 3 pounds automatically.
Yeah.
So that's one simple example of that, but it's, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there's those things. And so if we don't realize kind of what, and that's why, like, when working with people, it's nice to see patterns. Like, say I might work with a woman now who's having problems with a relationship, right? And maybe suffering abuse in different forms, right? Now, that may play out all the way back into her childhood, depending on how her father treated her or her father treated her mother. Because, again, the parents are God and Goddess. And so if she has an abusive father in one form or another, and she sees him as God. So he's then the perfect form of the masculine, right? She's going to be looking for that same form of the masculine for a partner.
It's just that transference.
And so it just goes, so she just keeps looking. And so until you can help her kind of work through that, right? She's going to keep picking the same partner. And so those are some of the things that are kind of happening, say, in the modern world, where it's like, hey, you can tell her all you want. Hey, you're picking bad partners, right? But if she can't actually work through the energetics of it, there's no way that she can actually make that decision, because in her subconscious, she thinks she's picking a god.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the very level of what that happens. And so for me, like going back a little bit for your question, is like, hey, my father was in the military, and when I was young and I did something wrong, he said, like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out. Right? It was that simple.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It was that simple. So then as a young kid, 3 years old, like, well, what are you to think?
Oh, well, God can smite you off the planet whenever he wants to, basically.
Right. Yeah.
So let's go into, I like the example we're talking about the woman in a bad relationship. Let's go down and explore that route a little bit. So now, let's say, for example, she's, going through these patterns of toxic relationships over and over for whatever reason. What's the first thing you would do with that person to get them to maybe, let's say, I guess the first step is becoming aware that they have those patterns. That'd be step number one, I'm guessing.
That's obviously the first one is just talking with them and letting the biggest thing that I do is listen, right? Because a lot of times the story never gets told. Right? A lot of times the story never gets told. Or like even with her friends, and her friends might turn her off, so she never feels that her story is actually received. Right? So that's the number one place to go, is just to listen. And not to say that story may be the absolute truth, because sometimes we all kind of have little add-ons to it, right? To get acceptance, to feel that somebody's actually listening, right? And the thing is, from my perspective, you don't buy totally into the story, because you need to be able to let them let go of the story.
Now, let's say, all right, you're listening intently and you're hearing her speak, and some things are becoming fairly evident and obvious to you. Is this where you start pointing out those little things that she's repeating? Do you start to saying, "Hey, I've noticed that blah 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 blah"? Like, this is something that I've seen in you.
When we're talking, like I can say, "Hey, do you start to see a pattern?" Like I can just say something simple, or maybe she catches the pattern.
Right.
Like a lot of times, people will go through it, and they'll because they haven't had the time to say it all out, they'll start seeing the patterns themselves.
So you act as a sounding board in a sense.
That's the first step.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. Okay. So now, let's say, for example, you've helped them discover this pattern, or they've figured it out on their own through maybe some prompting or whatever, just because they're at sounding board, or maybe they're just listening to themselves speak. Now they recognize they have a pattern of always being with somebody who is maybe neglectful or angry or something like that, or someone who cheats on them regularly, whatever. One of these patterns. What would you say? What's the next step? So they've recognized this pattern. Now, how do you start getting them out of that?
Well, the thing is to help as far as in the healing process, it's helping them work through the sadness and resentment and other feelings. Like, generally the way that the healing process will work is that once you can kind of help them go back through the cycle to the beginning of the cycle, and if you can help them kind of remove the energetic charge of what that was, then they're no longer attracted to it.
Right. So how, I guess my next question would be then, let's say you go all the way back to childhood when this initial wound first happened.
Right.
Then how do you reconcile that moment in their childhood so it doesn't carry on later on in life?
Well, that's through the healing ceremony that I would do with them that that would get resolved. And then the thing is, no matter what happens energetically, so you energetically resolve it, the person also has to go through some homework, like, okay, now you need to take steps. And say for women, almost the first step is, are you in a safe place? Right? That's the first thing. Like, are you in a safe place? Because normally it's a very common issue for women is that they either don't get out of the unsafe place that they're in, or they just don't get into a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like you're taking one step forward, two steps back almost, right? And so there needs to be some action taken in this world. Like you can undo or help them remove some of the energetic ties that are to that behavior. But if they don't start making new behavioral changes now, then they'll step back into the old pattern. So,
for example, creating a safe space for themselves might look like moving away from their current partner. So that could be the first step. So yes, you've identified these patterns. You've maybe helped eliminate this energetic charge that they had because of that situation. But then if they go back, they can easily fall back into that pattern. So the next step might be creating distance from that person or leaving the relationship altogether, potentially.
Yeah. Right? Because they have, and it has to do with anybody, really. Like, even if you're dealing with somebody with addiction, right? It's like, in order to have anybody step out of a pattern that they're in, you can't have them come out of, say, a healing situation and go right back into the pattern.
Yeah.
Right? Like, say, even using plant medicine, say like ayahuasca for addiction. Like, the best thing is if you actually stay down with the shaman or whatever and stay there for 2 weeks afterwards to let yourself integrate, right, with either like a boga or ayahuasca. It's like, give your time to integrate so you can separate out of what the old pattern is before you go back, move back into the city or something.
Right. Gotcha. I want to I jumped ahead a little bit in my line of questioning here, but I wanted to just ask, let's say, for example, you identified a certain pattern within somebody. What's the process like of actually going back to that initial wound? How do you start walking them through that, back to that initial time?
Well, just in talking with them. Now, sometimes, in some cases, people aren't aware of where the initial wound is.
Yeah, I imagine a lot don't.
Right.
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes it happens, like, even back in say, the womb. Like, the mother wasn't safe in the womb, and so then the child has this whole anxiety about them, and they got no idea why. And it was through kind of direct transference from the mother. The mother didn't feel safe, and there's things that were happening in her relationship or whatever, and so then the child never felt safe, right? And so then you can talk to the person all you want, but you'll never find it.
Right.
Right? And so then that's part of, say, for me, using my gifts to be able to go back and actually find out what happened. So it's more powerful if the person themselves can actually do it. And sometimes there's things like, say, if it is in the womb, there's different kind of ceremonies using a labyrinth or whatever that I can take a person back through, even being in their mother's womb. And maybe at that point, and it's not necessarily that you get this logical answer, right? And in some cases, people can talk to their mom and say, like, hey, were you going through something? So then they get the logical part if they want the logical part. Oh, yeah, I was going through fighting with your dad and da-da-da-da-da. But through different ceremonies and stuff, it's about letting go of the energetic part. Because once you let go of the energetic part, like say I've worked with plenty of people that have different addictions, and as soon as you get to the part, the one instance that caused that wounding, right, they can go back to try and using heroin or crack or whatever, and they'll come back and they say, like, what'd you do to me? Like, I tried using and it did absolutely nothing for me. And it's like, well, the wound's not there anymore. If the wound's not there, you can't put medicine on it, right? So once you find out what the wound is, then the person totally has, even if they wanted to use whatever it is they're using, they'll totally step away from it because it does absolutely nothing for them.
Gotcha. Right. Cool.
Well, I want to
sure,
because you said something interesting there that I think is, so you said, okay, if let's say we can't go back and they can't find out where their wound was, you mentioned that's when you can maybe apply some of your gifts and try to source that wound and find out where that energetic is. Can you talk about that a little bit? What did you mean by that, and how does, because that was kind of what I was starting in the whole beginning of this podcast, was like trying to get into like, there is this element of shamanism. Well, let's just answer that question. Like, okay, what did you mean by that?
So then we'd use what we'd call journeying. And to a certain extent, that's even what you do in the float tank, right? And so it's finding that quiet space. And so then if you go in with an intention, so then in, say, a healing instance, I'd go in with the intention of finding out what the initial wound is, right? And so I have a whole protocol of what I could do to go in to find out what the original wounding was, right? And so then in some cases in the healing ceremony, sometimes they'll have their own, it can be anything from something that they don't remember in this lifetime, or it could be something in a past lifetime, right? And so then, because I'm looking for the original source, so sometimes I might find something that might be in a past lifetime. And it's like, oh, this is what it is. And so you can bring back what we call, in general, it's called soul retrieval, right? And it can take like a bunch of different forms, but generally you're bringing back an energetic piece that person had lost, this fragmented self, and you're bringing the fragment back. And then you're going to help the person incorporate that fragment. And so they're missing this piece of energy. So as soon as you bring back this piece of energy and you reincorporate it in the person, all of a sudden the person's got more energy than they thought they ever had. Mm-hmm. Right? And in that way, we say we can change a destiny path by up to 30%. Like normally, your moment-to-moment decisions change your destiny path less than 1%. Now, going through this process, you can actually totally slide off that scale and shift your destiny line up to 30%. So it can make a huge change for a person, right? And to a certain extent, it depends on how much energy is in that. So it depends on how big the trauma was, and you bring back that piece, then that allows that person to make that huge change in their life, because now they've got that big chunk of energy that they never had.
Okay. So here's the rational scientist coming in here, Robert. So I'm here, and you just said some empirical numbers, like less than 1%, 30%. It sounds like it's empirically supported, but you're talking about journeying and going into past lives and identifying. Like that's the whole section I want to try to bring out to people, is like, what is that? And not that maybe there's an answer to this, but like in terms of your relationship, like how do you even start to explain that to people? Like,
to a certain extent, like when people come to me, like I don't advertise or anything. So when people come to me, they're normally at their wit's end and at the end of the rope, right? And in some cases, they kind of need to be there in order to kind of accept, hey, we're going to do something different, right? Like I've worked with a number of different people that have had some sort of condition or whatever, and doctors haven't been able to do anything about it for like 5 or 10 years, right? And through the process, and a part of the healing ceremony is actually helping them disengage, like say using a rattle or a drum, say would be common shamanic tools, say.
Yes.
And the whole reason of using that is that those things actually turn the logical conscious mind off.
Put you into a trance-like state.
Right, which, say, Mircea Eliade would call like an altered state of consciousness.
Right.
So you're helping that person get into an altered state of consciousness where their boundaries kind of come down, in which some of these other things can be brought up. Right? And there totally needs to be some sort of acceptance in the healing thing. It's like, I need to have your approval. If I'm going to work with you, I need to have your approval that you're going to allow me to help shift you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Or even like that aspect of how some people can be influenced by hypnosis and some can't. Well, I bet you probably like everybody can, but if someone's like dead set in their mind, like, nope, not going to do it, don't believe it or whatever, then they're probably not going to be influenced by hypnosis or gone into the hypnagogic state or that trance state, that altered state,
Well, yeah, like if you're so something simple like that, yeah, okay, you can just stop the process.
Right. And that's, so like you're talking about like having somebody say, yes, you can, allow and acknowledge it, but they still have to, they can even verbalize that, but if they don't let it happen in their own psyche, then it's not going to happen. I could say, yes, you can do it, but then still be like, nope, in my mind saying, no.
Well, to a certain extent. There are aspects of stuff in the energetic world or in the spiritual world that, like, I can say, hey, there's like dwarfs and fairies actually roaming around. Now, you can't see them, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so your belief of that would have absolutely no effect on whether or not they could have an effect on you. Right? And so there's yes and no parts. Like that's where things like sorcery and stuff.
Right.
Right? And that's also part of the misnomer of what a shaman is that, like I kind of said at the beginning, a shaman is the spiritual guardian and protector of a tribe of people. And so there's this misconception that anybody who says that they're a shaman is a good person, is a goody good. Shamans are totally neutral, because the universe is totally neutral, right? And so if somebody was to do something terrible to their tribe, they're going to fight. They're going to do what we call sorcery. And because they're meant to be the protectors of their tribe. And like I said earlier, if they don't protect their tribe and things go wrong, the tribe's going to kill them, right? So shamans know how to work kind of both sides of the street. Right? And that's a little bit, makes people a little bit, or they should be a little bit wary in modern times, because a lot of people are doing ceremonies just like to make money. Right? And having tens or hundreds of people doing ceremonies like ayahuasca, right? And it's straight for money, which it was never meant. And like, say, ceremonies like that traditionally were meant to be mostly one-on-one ceremonies, right? And so there's so much within this term of shaman and what's actually happening out there that we could sit here for probably a few days continuously and not really exhaust the subject.
Yeah, there's a point in there that I wanted to actually just kind of reiterate, and that I was listening to a really good interview with Don Howard Lawler, who owns Spirit Quest, that Andy and I are going to be going down to in a couple of weeks to do work with Mother Ayahuasca and Grandfather Wachuma. But and he said, like, the spirit world, it can interact with you whether you choose to believe in it or not. He said something like that in the interview as well, and so you kind of remind me of that, like this, about the dwarves and the gnomes and the elves, like they, whether you believe it to be true or not, doesn't mean it still can or cannot affect you.
Right, and like and it's something I taught you as well, is that, hey, with our 5 senses, right, we only take in less than 3% of what's out there, just of what man can measure, right? Say infrared, X-ray, all that. Like our 5 senses accounts for less than 3% of the spectrum. Forget about the stuff that we don't even know about or can measure, right? And our mind is trying to create a reality out of less than 3% of the information, right? Like if I said, hey, I'm going to send you to this financial advisor and I want you to invest all your money with them, and he knows less than 3% of the market, like you'd say, I'm nuts. You'd say, hey, I'm not listening to your advice. I'm not going to go invest all my money with that guy. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the kind of, but we invest that much into what we think we know, right? We think we know that much because of our experience. And in this society, like you either know it or you fake that you know it. And that's how you get ahead in this society. It's like, here, let me show you everything that I know, right? Whereas from my point of view, I want to tell you, I know crap, right? And that I'm open to how it's going to show up, right? Like I had a guy the other day that I went to visit, and he's got all these webcams set up and stuff in his place, and he's filming all these orbs and stuff. And these orbs have faces in them. And when you zoom in and you look at them, and he goes like, oh, those are demons, right? And I go like, can you tell like good by the bad just by looking at the face of somebody, and you can tell? Like, I know some people that I'd say are like really, really ugly, but they're the most beautiful, beautiful people that you'd ever want to meet. So here you're telling me that, and so we go into judgment right away, right? Like the first thing that we do, even when we meet somebody, is like, hey, what do you do? Because we want to become in judgment. We want to compare, well, what do I think of this person? This is what they do.
Yeah, and it's kind of a way of like looking at, well, ultimately when we meet somebody, I mean, I think on the deepest levels, like we want to connect, right? But our initial way of trying to do that is like, oh, what do you do? Like we're trying to get to know them, right? We're trying to like, so what do you do? Well, I do this job, but where really, I mean,
it's so funny too, because if somebody says, what do you do? It's a very open-ended question.
It's true. You can take that anywhere you want, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Well, I walk and I eat.
I breathe pretty frequently.
Right. It can be like, hey, it can be really simple, but it's where does it go?
Yeah.
And especially more so just in the modern context.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing like in finding a partner, right? Like, how do you choose your partner? Well, at first it's normally by looks, right? It's like, oh yeah, I'm attracted to them, right?
Yeah, and there's even stuff that goes on like that we're again not aware of, like pheromones, right? People, women actually can pick out their man's T-shirt. They'll smell like a row of 15 T-shirts, and they'll know which one that their partner was wearing because they know his smell.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that is the pheromones apparently like deliver genetic information about that person to the woman. So just by the smell or the pheromones, which you can't even smell most of the time, are actually giving that woman information based on your genetic makeup to see if that person is a suitable match for your genetics, which is crazy.
Yeah, and that's all happening subconsciously too.
Well, yeah, where are you getting it exactly? Yeah.
Yeah, because she's got 300 times more sense organs in her nose than a man does.
Yeah, like she's literally picking people based on which are probably going to give her offspring the best genetic makeup that they can based on what she has, right?
What's really interesting too is that they've done research showing that when women are on the birth control pill, it distorts that pheromone detection process, and so they're not, quote unquote, smelling their mate properly. And this is a phenomenon that they've kind of studied. And then quite often it's like, so, man meets woman, they get together, but at that time the woman's on the pill and isn't, smelling her man properly. And then, maybe they get married, and then, now it's time to have a child. And then she goes off the pill, and maybe they get pregnant, maybe not. But then apparently this happens quite a bit. This could happen is that now she's smelling him for the first time, really, once her biochemistry kind of recalibrates back into that normalcy, once, maybe a few months after she gets off the pill. And she doesn't like how he smells anymore. It's like, this is not a biological match or something like that. And she begins to get repulsed by him.
Yeah.
And apparently that's one explanation as to why, some divorce rates are a lot higher now. Is because, obviously the introduction of the pill, mid-1900s and stuff like that. So
yeah,
just a little interesting.
That's probably one little explanation. But just going back to Robert's point is that there's so much at play that, that we're not even aware of.
Right.
Right.
And so, that's a great, point to my initial question of like, how does somebody can at least be open to things they can't maybe rationally understand or explain at this point in time? It's like, well, you kind of do that automatically just based off what we do know scientifically of like all these, ultrasound and infrared and X-ray and UV ultraviolet and all these different levels of light and sound that we can't detect with our human instrument yet. And so it's like, what else there could there be?
Right. And like, I think everybody's had kind of something, say like a deja vu or some sort of experience that they can't really explain, right? And so, and like I say, like the universe is always knocking on our door. And there are different things to kind of set up for people to help them kind of further their intuition if they're open to it. Like, you have to be open. Like, you have to be able to say, hey, I think there's something else out there. Like, even right now, the younger generation now really knows that this kind of political system that we've got set up really doesn't work, right? Now, there's the rest of us older people that this is all that we've known, and so we're trying to hang on to this system that we've got. But the young people coming up, like, they know there's something fundamentally flawed with our system. And the thing is, like, okay, can we be open to creating something else, right? Because that's what we have to kind of come to is like, well, what is it that you want instead? So even with our life per se is like, hey, if you're really unhappy in your life, right, then it's like, well, okay, can you be open to actually trying something different? Like, that's why, like, people who come to me, like I say, I don't advertise anywhere. I get people that come to me with conditions that the medical community haven't been able to solve for them for 5 or 10 years. They say, we've got no idea what's wrong. Right? And so they come to me, and so then there's this openness, like, I don't care what you're going to do, but hey, I'm going to allow you to do it. Right? And I've worked with people that are like really strongly Catholic and whatever, and they go like, I'm just going to plug my ears when you're chanting and stuff because I don't want to know anything that you're doing, but if it's going to help, I'm going to open myself up to it.
Wow.
Right? But that, in some cases, that's what it takes. It takes for the person to be right at their wit's end to say, hey, I might be willing to open up and try something different. Now, and so there's different varieties of that. Some people are just going through different issues, like say with partners or whatever, and so they come and find out what the pattern is, help them step out of the pattern, and then, hey, they can do something else. So that raises their joy or happiness in life because they're able to step out of a pattern, right? And stepping out of blaming people, especially our parents, and say, hey, so then that just helps relationship. So then as a human being feels like they're in relationship and they feel like they're being held, like more in a more traditional kind of community where you've got like extended family. And that can be a hard thing to have, say, in the city, right? That's why, like, one of the best things that are done in community, if somebody, like, if you go to South America or Africa or Aboriginal Australia, if somebody really gets out of community and really falls on hard time, they bring them back in the community. They don't kick them out. They don't incarcerate them. They bring them right back into the center of the community and say, hey, you've really got some gifts. Hey, why don't you come and share them within the community?
So they don't launch the war on drugs on them and then attack them with spears and stuff?
No, because they know that, again, like the addiction or whatever the issue is, right, is just the symptom. It's the symptom of the wounding. So, so you see anybody that's like that and they're part of your community, you say, hey, you've kind of fallen out of the community and you're really on hard times. Like, come back in the community.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to touch on, because we've gone for like an hour 10, but I feel like we were just scratching the surface. I feel like we could go for another 2 hours, no problem. Maybe we will do that when we come back. I just wanted to touch on briefly, if you could go into the plant medicines and maybe just share whatever knowledge and maybe go through some of the ones you've worked with or some of the ones that that you find are in line with your type of work, perhaps. Maybe that's a good way of saying it.
Okay, so like in general, because basically when you're talking, if you want to use the word shaman, is basically we try to be in balance with everything. That's everything in creation. Like there isn't anything that is around us that wasn't put here or wasn't made available, right? And so then it's how do we use that in balance? Now, traditionally, the plants would be called plant teachers because they'd teach us. And what they teach us is another state of awareness, right? Now, if you train, you can use rattles and drums to get to a different state of awareness. Now, in some cultures, they, like I forget who the person who went down was talking. He was looking for medicines down in the Amazon. And so he went in and he's talking to the medicine people around, and they said, well, how do you know which plant to use for which condition? And the shaman there just kind of looked at him and he says, well, they tell us, of course. Right? And so like through that communication, like basically really everything here is sacred. Like even your food's sacred. Right? So it's about forming a relationship. So then with the different plant medicines, whether you want to talk wachuma, which is San Pedro, or ayahuasca, or iboga, or peyote, or whatever, it's like, or like even like what I call los hermanitos, the little brothers, the mushrooms, like they're all sacred. So the thing is, like, when you go into ceremony with them, it's like, well, hey, I'm coming to connect with you, right? Like, say, when I've worked, first few times that I worked with ayahuasca, I worked with a shaman, and the first time he gave me just a little bit of ayahuasca, and he says, this is just a kiss. This is the kiss from Mother Ayahuasca. So that was like just the introduction, right? And so then you work from there. And so it's kind of, for me anyway, it's like whatever plant that I'm working with, it's like, hey, this is like I'm working with another being. And if I'm ingesting or drinking or whatever, it's like I'm accepting that being to come inside of me, which is like a sacred thing. It's almost like sex, but more as sex would be for a woman, because a woman needs to take something inside, right? So actually doing this sort of thing is actually a feminine equivalent for a guy, say, right? Where you actually have to allow something inside you. So then it's like, well, what's the relationship going to be like? And it can be even like, say, Mother Marijuana is a sacred plant, right? Now she has like 4 different aspects as far as I see, right? Like if somebody's using her totally recreationally, I see her almost like a street girl, right? Just strictly for pleasure, right? Other people use her for creativity. So then she may appear to me kind of like the artsy girl, the kind of hippie girl, whatever, that's got this creative flair, right? Maybe looking a little bit nerdy with glasses, right? Then the next aspect of her is now people are using her kind of medicinally to take away pain, right? So then there's that aspect of her. And then there's the people that are really actually looking for the healing properties of the plant, the sacred healer, where she's just another level even above that. Because the pain, when we just want her to take away the pain, we're not really asking to connect with her. We're saying, I'm in victim mode, I'm in pain, please take away my pain. Here, I'm a victim. Whereas if you get into the higher aspect with her and you're really trying to say, hey, I really want to learn about how I'm out of balance, right? Like, what is it about me that's really out of balance, and can you help me to let that go, right? Then she becomes the sacred healer, right? So then there's that aspect of the plant that totally unlocks, because now you realize that she's sacred and you're asking for help, and you're letting her in consciously at a different level. And that's the same thing when you're working with any of the plant medicines. If you actually recognize that they're sacred, and that you're sacred and you're on a sacred journey, and you're looking for some information to help you. Because for me, what the perspective is like all these different plants or whatever are along the rim of a wheel, right? And they're showing you their different aspect and perspective of creation in the center. Now, in my experience, what happens is that when you make enough connections with enough of them, make good connections with them, all of a sudden you get taken straight to the center and you get to see creation. And so then it doesn't matter which one you use, right? And I even told you the story before we got on about how with Don Howard and with Wachuma or San Pedro, he was using fresh limeade to accentuate the experience. And that after that, because I'd made a connection through the limes to the Wachuma, now I can drink lime juice and I can bring up a Wachuma experience. But having said that, now basically what any of the plant medicines do is it takes me straight to the center. So it's like, oh, so I had this perspective from say mushrooms, or from ayahuasca or iboga or San Pedro, right? But once you learn how to get to the center, after a while you just go straight to the center, and in the center they say, well, what's your intention? And then it's easy. And for me, I'd add on that outside circle like a float tank, right? Or it can be a didgeridoo, it can be a drum, it can be a rattle. So once you learn different ways into the center, there's a million different ways into the center.
Gotcha. So that's Robert on the plant medicines and potential uses of plant medicines. And one last thing here, unless Mike, you have anything burning that you want to talk about. Let's just talk about the center. What is the center?
What is the center? Once you can kind of, I don't know what the center is, right? Like there's a spot where you feel that you're in the flow of creation. So when you feel that you're in that flow of creation, right, I'd say that that's the center, right? Now the thing is, as a human being, normally we can find the flow of creation. Like I come back, like I was born in the 60s, so like I've watched a lot of Errol Flynn movies. So I kind of had the term like in like Flynn. So when you think that things couldn't possibly go right and they go absolutely right, that's when you know when you're in the flow of creation, right? Now the trick is to kind of stay in it, right? And from a shamanic point of view, it's like, how do you stay in there? Because when you get in that flow of creation, like I said, like things can just go right for what seems like no reason. Like the logic goes out the window, right? Now the thing is, when we get into that situation, normally as human beings, we like to fall asleep, right? Like we don't like to be aware, we like to just enjoy it. Oh yeah, I'm gonna put my feet up. It's like going down the river in a canoe, right? And you go, oh, the water's great right now. I'm just going to take a snooze. I'm going to put the hat over my eyes, and I'm just going to let the canoe go to wherever it wants to, because it seems like it's just going in a straight line, and I'm in the middle of the current. Well, all of a sudden, life happens, and if you're not aware, the river takes a left-hand turn, and you ground your canoe into the bank. And that's kind of what happens to us. We kind of think everything's perfect, that nothing's going to happen. And because like most people just like to say, oh, if I could just have a break, I just want to be able to shut off. And guys are really good at that. Even when they come home, like from work at night, it's like I get home, I just want to eat and I want to put my feet up and I don't want anybody interacting with me. I go like into the no brain zone, right? And humanity in general likes to do that. And then we complain that we've fallen out of sync with creation. And that's the hardest, like that's what life is. Life is navigating that stream of creation and staying in it for as much as we can. And that's the hardest thing. But that's what we're trying to do. But if we can realize some of the things that we're doing, like say areas of freedom of choice and what real free choice is, we can kind of stay in that more than not. And that's what we're trying to do.
All right, last question. Last question. Okay, what is true freedom of choice?
Well, I explained it. There's only the three spots where you really have freedom of choice, right? Like, in the way that I'd explain it is you got somebody who admits that they're an alcoholic, right? So say they go to something like AA and they're trying to learn different things of ways to step out of alcoholism, right? And so that would be the first tenet. Well, what are you learning and who are you learning it from? So Alcoholics Anonymous is a pretty good place to learn about trying to stop drinking, right? So then the next step is like, well, who do you hang out with? Well, I know when I was in university and stuff and I was drinking pretty heavy, I had my drinking buddies, right? And so then the next thing is, well, where do you go? Well, if you're going out and you're drinking all the time, normally you're with your drinking buddies, and normally you're at a pub or a club somewhere. So say in this example, Buddy's trying to quit drinking, and his buddies come up and say, hey, come on, Joe, come on, we're gonna go down to the pub and we're gonna watch the Canucks game. And Buddy says right away, sorry boys, I can't come because I'm stopping drinking. And I can't go to the pub with you guys. And the boys say, oh, come on, it's the Canucks game. You don't have to drink. You can have free choice. Look, you can have a pop or a water. Just come on and hang out with us. Just watch the Canucks game. Right? So Buddy goes like, that sounds pretty logical. That sounds pretty rational. I can still exercise my free choice. And I know I can go down there and I can have a strong will and I can not drink. Right? Well, it gets down there and everybody's drinking. And then all of a sudden the Canucks are up 8-0 or whatever, and everybody's drinking and having a great time. And Buddy feels a little bit kind of left out. He's not in his normal place with the boys because the boys are drinking. And all of a sudden the boys say, oh, come on, just have one. Like, just because you have one beer doesn't mean you're an alcoholic. Come on, we'll even buy you the drink. Right? And so Buddy, after a bit, caves in. Now he can berate himself and he can say, oh man, I am so terrible. Look, I drank. Right? But his freedom of choice wasn't at the very end when he actually said yes to the beer. His free choice was kind of the two choices before that, who he was going with and where he went. And so if we can recognize where those choices are, we can actually take better steps to actually do what it is we say we want to do. And then we don't have all the self-judgment and other judgment that comes with it when we set ourselves kind of up to fail, when we kind of take ourselves out of the free choice because of decisions that we made before.
Gotcha.
Right.
Right. So I think you could probably say that. So he had a free choice at the beginning, and it was a much easier free choice, and he still had that free choice at the bar. However, it's a lot harder now to make the right choice.
Well, it's just the odds are really stacked against you at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, I think I'm satisfied for right now.
Yeah.
But
it's a good little intro to Robert.
Yeah, definitely. But we could definitely, I felt like, this could be a 3-hour podcast, no problem. And maybe we do that sometime. But I think that's pretty cool. Great intro anyways. How about yourself?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you coming on, Robert, and just letting us ask these questions and you just, speaking what you know and sharing. I really appreciate that.
No, you're welcome. Yeah, and if we want to do more,
So where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Where could they find me? I guess the best way would probably be on Facebook.
Cool.
It's like Robert Ellison.
Cool. Facebook. I thought you were going to say if they really want to find me, they can enter into a prayer space and I will connect with their spirit in the ether. But you're just like, no, Facebook,
they can come in here to the float tank and kind of sit in the float tank, and probably somebody will say who is this Robert guy? And somebody will probably know.
It's true. Yeah, if you go in the float house, Robert's well known around here for sure.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Cool.
So it's Robert Ellison, Robert Ellison. So yeah, hunt him down on Facebook, shoot him a message if you want to connect and maybe ask a couple more questions, or if you feel like you just want some more information from him, definitely don't hesitate. He's very open and very generous with your time to let that connection happen. So.
Yeah, if somebody wants to go out, normally I just say let's go out for a tea or something, we'll go for a walk, and that just allows people to kind of have that space to say what they need to say.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, cool. I guess we can wrap it up. A few things that I forgot to mention at the beginning was we're also sponsored by Grind Bar.
Oh yeah.
And I keep forgetting to bring that one up at the beginning, which I will have to make a habit of that.
Yes.
But Grind Bar is basically an energy bar, which is amazing. And it also is a CBD product, so it's really good for inflammation and getting focused and grounded, but it gives you a little bit of energy, so if you want to go and be proactive and get work done and focus, it's a great tool for that. So definitely check out Grind Bar. I think it's grindbar.com, or it's The Grind Bar on Facebook. Okay. So definitely check that out. And, of course, link up with us in the community pages, the various ones we have. There's the Float House community page, which you have to be a member at Float House, obviously. Then there's the Vancouver Real community page, and you can just be anybody, and we'll accept you into that group. And then there's the Mindful Mass, and same thing for that one. Yep. And definitely come out to all those awesome communities, really like-minded people. Just great to see the people that are coming out to these things. Very, very cool.
Yeah. And if you're not on Facebook, we have mailing lists for both those.
Yeah, so mindfulmass.org and vancouverreal.tv and floathouse.ca are all the websites.
There you go.
And also, last but not least, if you like what you heard today, give us a review and rating on iTunes, Stitcher, or YouTube. That really helps us get found, and it's a great way to support the podcast. Just sharing and liking and commenting. That stuff, despite what people says, it actually means something in Facebook and social media world. So if you can support the podcast by doing that, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, very much so. And that's it. So thanks for joining us, folks. And until next time.
To whatever is.
To whatever is.